right, so I've learned from Mary last time to start with a cast of characters, Mary. So here we go. Okay, so pay attention to this one. Okay. The man on the left is Charles Augustus Lindbergh. There you go. He started life in a 7-bedroom mansion in Minnesota. But while he was still young, that mansion burned to the ground and his father's business collapsed. Charles Lindbergh, as a kid, lived in boarding houses and rented rooms with his mother, while his father served in Congress. His education was described as episodic. He was pulled out of school at the age of 14 to drive his father around Minnesota in his senatorial campaign. Charles was expelled from the University of Wisconsin after 3 semesters. It was 1922. He took a motorcycle to Nebraska and enrolled in a flight school. He saw 4 people die in training accidents in his first week. But he never looked back. 5 years later, in May 1927, Lindbergh flew eastward across the Atlantic, becoming the first person to make it nonstop from New York to Paris. That's character number 1. This one's more difficult, so here we go. Second from the left is Ehrenfried Gunther Freiherr von Hohenfeld. You'll have to tell me if I did that okay. He was the son of a major German industrialist and landowner. He was blind in his right eye from birth and had half a leg amputated in a motorcycle accident in World War I. He studied aviation in Berlin and had the money to buy airplanes. 1 year after Lindbergh made his transatlantic flight, von Hohenfeld wanted to carry on this legacy. He assembled a German/Irish crew and set out to do the opposite of Lindbergh, to fly from Paris to New York. The prevailing headwinds made this a more difficult feat. The mid-1920s were prime time when it came to record-setting airplane stunts. And the American people genuinely loved these stories. A cynical person like me thought maybe they really loved these stories. They put their money where their mouth was. When pilots landed successfully, they were instant celebrities and were treated as such. Amelia Earhart was just about to become the first woman to fly eastward across the Atlantic in June of 1928. So this was the moment for von Hohenfeld. The German-Irish crew of the Junkers aircraft Bremen tried to be the first to go the other way. Von Hohenfeld's men didn't quite accomplish that task, but they did fly nonstop from Ireland to Labrador, the Canadian coast. And they became the first people to cross the Atlantic in a westerly direction. The man second to the right is Frederick Robert Zimmerman, the 25th governor of Wisconsin. Zimmerman came from a German family in Milwaukee. He made his political name with the phrase, "turn on the lights." When he was first elected to the state assembly in 1909, he led a campaign to investigate the campaign finances of all his opponents. Turn on the lights was his way of calling for transparency and honesty in state politics. He worked his way up through the legislature. He served as Secretary of State for Wisconsin and then was elected governor in 1926. He leaned heavily into his German ancestry while in office, and he expanded his appeal to German American Wisconsinites. He presented himself as a straight shooter and a friend of the people. That's number 3. On the far right is Nettie App. Nettie App. I couldn't find a picture of Nettie App, but there's a German fitness app called Nettie, so this is as close as we're going to get to Nettie App. Nettie App was born Nettie Burns, the daughter of a farmer/merchant. Her parents ran a grocery store on the Isle of Kew at the turn of the 20th century. It was when she was 32 years old, she married Samuel App, a Monroe Township farmer. This was her first marriage and Samuel's second. They lived, I think of it now as out by the roundabouts, but they lived out there by the roundabouts. and were known for throwing large dinners for friends and family. In the 1920s, the biggest happening on Samuel and Nettie's farm was when a large turkey attacked a newly painted automobile because he saw his reflection in the side panel and thought he was being challenged by a rival. Entrepreneur Harvey Sterner, used this incident as advertisement for his new car painting business and got the story onto page 6 of the Selinsgrove Times. Nettie was not quoted about Turkeygate, but I like to think that she rolled her eyes, took a shot of whiskey, and slaughtered the turkey. That's just me, no evidence for that. So here we go. This is a technique called immersion. Ready? So these are the 4 players in tonight's story. They're connected in a pretty straightforward way. It's almost mathematical. If Lindbergh hadn't conquered the Atlantic in 1927, then von Hunfeld wouldn't have made his attempt in 28. If von Hunfeld hadn't partially succeeded in April 1928, then Zimmerman wouldn't have shown up in Nettie App's backyard. Let me explain. Governor Fred Zimmerman was a political animal. He knew a good photo op when he saw it. And you might notice a little foreshadowing throughout these early slides. You might see a pattern here. He knew a good photo op when he saw it. Sitting in Wisconsin in April of 1928, he was convinced that he needed to go somehow tap into the story of the Bremen. The crew of the Bremen had barely touched their wheels down in Labrador when he started working the phones. These airmen were about to become huge news. An estimated 2 million people were about to line the streets of New York for a ticker tape parade in their honor. Zimmerman saw an opportunity to capitalize on some of this aviation fever. He'd been trying to make himself known as the flying governor for about a year now. He had some modest success. He was always in planes, photographed the planes, the flying governor. So this made sense for him. He had several big political battles in Madison that spring, but he had the time to lobby hard for the crew of the Bremen to come to Madison to celebrate with a German-American governor. This, by the way, is what we're thinking about. This is the Bremen, this airplane. This was what all the fuss was about. 4 men actually shoved themselves into this plane. Zimmerman noted that Wisconsin was the closest state to the East Coast at the time with a German governor. He was convinced that he could talk the crew to come to Madison. The previous year, he had convinced Charles Lindbergh to park the Spirit of St. Louis in Madison 3 months after his transatlantic flight. For a week or two, getting the Bremen to Madison seemed to be the only thing he cared about. The German flyers were wined and dined in New York and Washington, D.C. That's von Hunfeld on the right. By the first week of May, Zimmerman had gotten even more ambitious. He wanted to meet the flyers somewhere outside of Wisconsin and then fly into the state together in separate planes. It would be a media spectacular, he explained. This would be a huge attention getter, and the Zimmerman name would become cemented in people's minds as wingman to the aviation heroes. So Zimmerman had a lot of ideas, and he had the political power to make it happen. It was eventually announced that the Bremen would visit Chicago and Milwaukee. Zimmerman was determined to have them visit Madison as well. For some reason, he really felt that Madison was going to be the coup he needed. He announced in the final week of April that he would fly to New York City himself to personally appeal to the men of the Bremen. He asked the U.S. Army for a plane to use for this mission. The Army dragged its feet. Royal Airways eventually agreed to provide an aircraft. Royal Airways connected Madison with a daily flight to Chicago. They operated out of Penco Airport. That's Madison in the background. Penco Airport was named as such because the Pennsylvania Oil Company had an exclusive marketing agreement with the owner of this airport. The plane was the Miss Penco 2. This was a 5-passenger closed cabin monoplane at a time when all 3 of those things were pretty amazing. That it could house as many as 5 passengers, that it had a roof on it and you weren't open to the elements, and that it was not a biplane, it was a monoplane. Most planes at this time were still biplanes. Monoplanes, single wing planes came into vogue in the 1930s. So Zimmerman, an aide, and a few press people would fly from Madison to New York to hold an audience with the Bremen crew. The pace of their trip to New York shows just how remarkable these transatlantic journeys are. These were real feats, and this trip here shows it. The governor's plane left Madison and made it to Cicero, Illinois. So the idea here is you're going from Madison, in one day getting to Cleveland, staying overnight in Cleveland, and then going the next day to New York. They made it as far as Cicero, just on the western outskirts of Chicago. There, they had to wait for an hour for fuel. I'm not proud of this animation, but it's the... I couldn't get rid of the line for the land, right? So they landed in Cicero for fuel. After that, it took 2 hours to restart the engine and take off again. So 3 hours in Cicero on the outskirts of Chicago. Here's the takeoff. See, oh, look at that. That line keeps following. Then they made the next hop to Cleveland. All the while, they enjoyed perfect flying weather, according to the telegram that the party sent back to Wisconsin newspapers from Cleveland. The late edition of the two main papers in Madison included a little blurb on the front page saying that Zim was okay and was on schedule. But on Saturday, May 5th, as they made the trip from Cleveland to New York, they ran into one of the storms. There we go. Look at that. Ooh. They ran into one of the storm fronts that had been sweeping across the Northeast for several weeks. Flooding, wind bursts, more flooding, and hail all terrorized people from Virginia to Maine in April and then May. April 1928 was a doozy of bad weather, and early May looked to continue the trend. On May 1st, 3 days before Zimmerman and his party started their trip, New York Congressman Thaddeus Sweet became the first U.S. politician to die in a plane crash when his plane took off from Williamsport, hit a bad storm, and then plummeted into a dairy farm outside of Binghamton. The Miss Penco 2 crew was delayed. So now we're hitting Pennsylvania here. The Miss Penco 2 crew was delayed by a fuel tank leak that made them land unexpectedly near Millheim. So eventually on this meandering map, Millheim will appear. There they identified the leak and it basically patched it. As they worked on this, the afternoon skies were darkening. It took 2 hours to get the engine to restart. This seems to be a theme for the Miss Penco 2. You had to bank those 2 hours of restart time. They eventually took off again around 4 p.m. using the airmail beacon system to guide them eastward as the cloud deck grew more ominous. The airmail route from New York to Chicago went directly over Selinsgrove, and there was a series of emergency airmail landing fields dotting the landscape. These had been designated and equipped with beacons in 1925. Airmail in 1928 was still a sign of the modern age. Government officials loved to talk about airmail and how it was a testament to American ingenuity and foresight. By 1928, airmail had been around for about 10 years. The beacons for 3 years, but airmail itself for about 10. But only since the Airmail Act of 1925 had private companies been able to bid for airmail contracts. So there was a loose, lightly regulated network of roughly 200 pilots with varying amounts of experience, flying planes with varying levels of maintenance, working out of airfields with varying degrees of accessibility and infrastructure. Most of the pilots had some flying experience, mostly from World War I, but they ran into trouble regularly. No one should be amazed or surprised that airmail planes crashed pretty much all the time. Central Pennsylvania, in particular, was known for bringing airmail pilots down to earth. I just noticed, I promise you, I just noticed that. It was a pun. In 1925, 3 widely reported fatal crashes occurred, 2 near Belfont and 1 near Bloomsburg. Airmail pilots were trained to avoid fog banks, to avoid snowstorms and squall lines, as you might expect. But they worked under the demands of the airmail guarantee, quote unquote. The promise that items delivered by airmail would get to their destination faster than regular train-borne mail. The epitome of the airmail guarantee was the boast that a letter mailed in New York on a Monday morning could get to Los Angeles by 5 p.m. on Wednesday, instead of 9:30 in the morning on Friday. This demand pushed pilots to compromise. Essentially, they came to terms with the practice of flying blind. They aimed for the Woodward Gap, the Narrows, if you will. But they knew they wouldn't always be able to see it. They used a compass and an altimeter to make the best guess in such situations. The beacons set up between the official airfields were meant to be another layer of safety in what was inherently a dangerous job. So the crew of the Miss Penco 2 was following these beacons as it meandered eastward from Milheim, but they were caught in heavy rain, lightning, fog, heavy winds. They couldn't see anything, and the pilot brought the plane down around 6:30 in the evening. They had made it to Selinsgrove. Now, this was 20 years before Penn Valley Airport came in, so the tilled fields of the App Farm north of Selinsgrove were the best option for an urgent landing. Nettie App was at her kitchen window, keeping an eye on the storm. It was a pretty fast-moving front. The wind was terrible. She and other people in the area could hear the Miss Penco 2 before they saw it. The plane was flying low and it was circling erratically. By the time it came down in the field behind Nettie's house, several dozen people were aware that it was in distress. As the back end of the storm passed, Nettie rushed out to the edge of the orchard and spoke to the men as they tumbled out of the plane. So here they are. Here's the press saying they're going off, leaving Madison, and here's the press after the fact when they become Selinsgrove's distinguished guests. The first thing she did, apparently, Nettie, was give the governor a crash course on whose land he had just ditched onto. It wasn't her and her husband's land, she said. It was the estate of the late Norman App, who had died 2 years earlier. And I couldn't find, and Bo, you probably know, I couldn't find what kind of family connection was between Samuel App and Norman App, but maybe you'll tell us later if you know. Possibly, okay. I was searching through. Okay. So it was the estate of Norman Apps, who had died 2 years earlier. Robert App, who was Norman's son, had also heard the plane above Monroe Township, so he eventually arrived too. Nettie turned the governor over to him, apparently not knowing or perhaps not caring that he was 1/48th of the fraternity of U.S. governors. The borough's police and fire departments responded to the landing. The emergency call turned into a welcome wagon after they discovered that all was well. And once they understood that the governor of Wisconsin was in this plane, they thanked Robert App for tending to the new arrivals and drove them to the Hotel Sterner for dinner. So Nettie App kind of gets written out of the story at this point. She goes back in her kitchen and no one ever mentions her again. I think that's sad because I put a lot of effort into finding a picture of Nettie. But all I have from Nettie App is a death certificate from 1942. So a brass band played a few marches before the meal at the Hotel Sterner. This was the Moose Band, which had come together only 4 years earlier as the first community band in a generation. So imagine the scene. It's a mid-spring evening. A storm has come and gone, so Market Street is glistening. You're a store owner, and you're out sweeping your sidewalks, checking anything that might have flown away. Then some portion of the Moose Band shows up, and they start playing rousing patriotic music. Word spreads slowly that the governor is in the Hotel Sterner. Again, you think? Wasn't he just here a few months ago to inspect the construction site of the state epileptic hospital? But eventually it becomes clear that this isn't Pennsylvania's governor, John Fisher, but a visiting governor from the upper Midwest. So it's a novelty, and local people gather to see what's going on. Governor Zimmerman was a good sport. He fielded questions from well-wishers while he was trying to pay attention to what local leaders were telling him about Selinsgrove and politely eating his meal. Someone in the crowd yelled that if the governor was interested in good Pennsylvania beer, this was the place to get it. They meant Selinsgrove in general, but they probably also meant the Hotel Sterner specifically. This was 1928, 8 years into Prohibition, and the Hotel Sterner had managed to keep in business through a variety of means. One of them, it was whispered, was the illegal sale of alcohol. The governor, at least publicly, declined the offer. Other people started milling about. This was a Saturday night, so it was already pretty crowded. It was the most crowded night of the week downtown. After that squall line passed through, it was a humid and breezy night. It became downright festive with Zimmerman there. The dauntless hook and ladder boys came and brought a fire engine. SU students gathered into the fray. There were apparently several sources of illegal alcohol that night, because the Selinsgrove Times reported that, quote, rowdies from neighboring towns almost ruined the night by making Selinsgrove seem like a den of debauchery. This was an image problem with the governor there, but it was manageable. The Times blamed Millersburg and Sunbury for the trouble and said that the chaos agents would have been arrested in a less welcoming borough. Zimmerman eventually left the hotel and gave a short speech at the corner of Market and Pine. It was probably 8 or 8:30 by this time. He and his people then went to the newspaper office at 103 South Market, where they used the telephone to make calls to their families in Madison, to newspapers in Madison, and to the hotel of the Bremen crew in New York. Zimmerman told the Bremen handlers that he'd be there tomorrow late afternoon at the latest. The night ended with a sort of open house session in the lobby of the hotel. I would like to believe that it looked like this, but it probably looked like this. The lights went out and everybody went to bed. The Wisconsin State Journal, one of the two main newspapers in Madison, referred to all residents of Selinsgrove as the Dutch. So their coverage of the incident noted, during the banquet, the Dutch became so enthusiastic about aviation that they decided then and there to establish a municipal airport. And Governor Zimmerman arose at 5 o'clock Sunday morning to go to their selected site and turn over the first shovelful of dirt for the project. This was the Isle of Kew, the Burns and McFall tract, which was just south of Bow Street and extended from the river on the east to the former canal bed on the west. Howard Burns and Clark McFall bought the farm property in 1925 from the widow Catherine Smith. Burns and McFall were chummy business partners in several efforts over the years: a tobacco shop, a pool room, a popular candy business, and now real estate property development. This was a patch of land that had hosted fairs and festivals in the late 19th century. Now it was subdivided into 310 lots dubbed the Susquehanna Shore Development. 47 of those lots were along the riverfront, with more along Bow Street. In the summer of 1926, the borough annexed this land. So this now became Selinsgrove in 1926. The following summer, Burns and McFall offered to give the borough a 25-lot swath of the property for a senior high school for Selinsgrove. That project never materialized, though the school board did accept the gift. Now, with the governor of Wisconsin in town, Burns and McFall pledged an airstrip to bring Selinsgrove into the aviation age. 3 months after the governor's stay, and this airstrip was going to be in the southwest corner, so roughly down there, right, in the southwest corner of this tract. 3 months after the governor's stay, that airstrip on the Isle of Kew hosted the first air show in the Susquehanna Valley, or at least the central Susquehanna Valley. It coincided with official opening ceremonies, a 3-day extravaganza at which it was named Zimmerman Airport. 2 men who flew with Amelia Earhart in June were brought in to wow the crowds. Burns and McFall also commissioned a military convoy to head north up the river from the Federal Air Depot at Middletown for a bombing demonstration that Selinsgrove Times promised would, quote, afford a presentation of wartime attack. And they wrangled the USS Los Angeles, a massive dirigible, to make the trip over from New Jersey. But bad weather giveth and bad weather taketh away. The same type of storm that dropped the Wisconsin governor from the sky onto Selinsgrove also stopped the blimp and the military planes from coming to town. A medium-sized crowd saw a few planes do stunts, and they saw these two characters, Pauline Brugger and Byron Herman. They saw them get married in a plane flying over the brand new Zimmerman field. They did it for $100 and presumably true love. They crowded with a justice of the peace and the pilot into a cockpit made for two people. It was said to be the first wedding in the sky in the Susquehanna Valley. So that was something. If you missed the festivities because you didn't want to stand in the rain all day, you could see images of it at the Stanley Theater in the following weeks. Before the main feature, they would show you snaps, I guess, of the Zimmerman airport dedication and a plane in the distance in which people were getting married. So, rewinding back to the Zimmerman affair. After that ceremonial first shovel on the Isle of Kew, in the gentle glow of Sunday's sunrise, the governor was driven around the town a little, then up to Reservoir Hill, where he was shown the view of the river valley and the sun rising above the ridge across the river. Then it was time to go. The Bremen crew awaited in New York, so after a couple of hours of coaxing the engine into service, the Miss Penco 2 took off, and the governor was whisked away from Selinsgrove forever. When Zimmerman's plane took off on Sunday morning, by the way, they had to bring it down again just east of Sunbury in an emergency airmail field because they lost power in the engine. They changed the spark plugs in about 10 minutes, and then 120 minutes later, they took off. That was my favorite part of the story, that plane always took 2 hours. Zimmerman made it to New York a day late. He was given a 20-minute meeting with the crew of the Bremen, during which they told him they simply could not get to Madison. Their publicity manager would have none of it. When Zimmerman returned to Madison the next day, it was by train. Zimmerman Airport never really had enough traffic to make it a going concern. It ran for about 5 years, but the effort of keeping the field clear and operating navigation lights was never warranted by the business. So it fell dormant in 1933 and sat as a weedy field until World War II, when it was just briefly revived as part of civil defense efforts during the war. Fred Zimmerman died in late 1954. After his funeral, Don Anderson told a Wisconsin newspaper that he had a confession to make. In 1928, Don Anderson had been the managing editor of the Wisconsin State Journal. He was one of the members of the governor's travel party in 1928. In a crowded room, or from a distance, the two men looked a little like each other. They took advantage of that as the Saturday evening wore on in Selinsgrove. So that's Anderson on the left and Zimmerman on the right. Anderson on the left, Zimmerman on the right. For a governor of a state like Wisconsin, it's really hard to find good photographs of Fred Zimmerman. That's a weird thing I learned during this. So Anderson revealed that the governor was tired and had a bad headache after dinner at the Hotel Sterner. He wanted to retire to bed early. But the carnival atmosphere was so raucous that Zimmerman didn't feel like he could just pack it in and go off to his room. So he asked Anderson to pose as him and carry on the festivities. Anderson said in 1954 that he resisted the idea, but then the governor introduced him to a newcomer to the hotel as the governor. And then he did it again and again. There's almost this shift change between leaders and dignitaries at the hotel. So everybody who knew who the governor was left, and new people came in who didn't know. So after about 15 minutes of this, Anderson said it was easier to go along with the ruse, especially once the governor really did leave and go up to bed in the hotel. So apparently, the governor who went out and gave a speech on the corner of Market and Pine wasn't really the governor. The governor who spent the evening and the wee hours of the morning celebrating with townspeople was not the real governor. And the man who went out to the Isle of Kew to turn over a shovel full of mud was absolutely not the governor of Wisconsin. Wisconsin newspapers picked up this story for about 3 hours, right? Cared about it intensely for an afternoon. And then the story of the governor who dropped from the sky went away. Thank you for listening.